Okay. Triangulation lines, heights, interference. We've got an X line, Y line, rotation, certification, setting, travels. Increment, location settings, and encryptions. Direct the modification lines and calculate setting. Put everything back in track lines is zero gravity, zero motion. That's all communication system, how you go through Earth line, your powers, and your atmospheres. So the team line circles is line communications. They're going to go through the information ground lines. You guys are going to have your gills, correlations that grow with highest interference. It's going to be modified through towers, lines, and communication lines of cycles. And we'll go through the calculations, green lines, adaptation lines of tunnels and traffications, earth line surface, ground line centers, line rotation, certification to its calculation, growthy lines, flux capacitor, and through line triangulation, split lines of anomaly, box frame, and triangulation. Sets lines of two lines, correlation lines of two tractions, and three line rotation surface and location. Sensor calculation, line setting height calculation. Directs modification, next 2,000 platitudes, docking 1, and position of docking 2, and position of docking 3 in settings. Okay. Ground centers, operation lines of tunnels lines, 1 in position, 2 in tractions, and 3 lines of set location. Okay, so you guys are here coming out of the portal, line setting in travel. Okay. Position lines of correlation settings, going through tube line setting, 1 setting, line position 2 setting, set location of 3 setting, in set location. Okay. All right. So the center correlation line interference, the growth things are coming in. These are the growth things here, instructions right there. The center core lines are the 3 tractor line communication lines of TV reception and screen interference. The set lines communication position of its program and the 4 line communication setting to travel. Okay. There's set correlation settings. They set up communication lines with its box frame. 1 platform and 1 communication. Directs lines, calculation lines into 2 platforms. Sets communication lines across line signals and line setting high interference in travel position of point graphs. Calculate lines, centers, sketch lines, correlation settings, schematics over screen lines, adaptation lines of surface. Triangulates position lines of programs, sets correlation track lines, sets communication lines of measure, sets communication lines of center, in track case line condition setting to starports. Starports correlation lines of 1 X line rotation surface, 1 X channel, and then 3 lines of correlation lines, XX position equal lines of 1 track line setting location. Directs modification line screens highest interference. Now, the position to its program is understanding how to go through the pyramid screen lines, adaptation lines of surface and traction. Okay, that's all set up now. All right. So the team line has gone down the tubing. Okay, so you're 300 million meters per line. Underground settings, right? You're in the liquid formation of your center core lines of the Earth that rotates the surface and realigns its position location. Now, tunnel defense lines of security. It sets lines of communication to 1 track location, right? Now, the center core system opens up a line screen. Okay, that opens up line, center line interference, and closet correlation lines of galaxy screen lines, adaptation lines of surface. Positioned as process, then we opened up signals into platitude of Pluto, opens up the portals, lines of stargates, line screen, and a 3-line rotation surface and traction. Now, directs the signals line calculation setting, the moon comes in, half pipe line signal set location, travel line signal lines into lines equals lines of 2 X lines and 1 line center, flux, sex communication of flux, and line center of the flux in the sun and the moon attractions, 0, 0, 0. Position of past, present, future. Correlates calculation motion lines center on interference, taking out calculation motion lines added for first response. Indirect lines of panels in a magnetic highway information line screen and a cloud line screen lines, adaptation of surface and traction. Done by equation, confirmation verified. It's all done. All right, that's done. All right, so you guys, 20 minutes on the clock lines in line communication settings. Have fun and traction. Okay, so directing lines of signals, we go through fluctuation. Flux lines, communication, Y line centers, change communication setting. Position of Y line, right? Equals lines of correlation lines of an H line rotation surface. Now the H line rotates the surface in a retract location provision. Sets lines of 1 traction and 2 line set location, right? So 5, right? Y equals lines of Y. So that's lines of a flat surface and 1 lines of a 3-line rotation center in calculation of 4 setting of 7 provision. Sets correlation high calculation setting, 4 lines of 3. Sets communications of 3 lines of 4. Sets communication lines of 3, 3, 3, and 3 track location. 4 cycles line division, 1 center, 2 center, 3 rotation surface, and portals and line condition setting to a half pipe traction in all lines, directions, and center core setting and set locations. All right, so we got 0, 0, 0 now. Okay. Y lines equals lines of 4, 3 lines of 3 lines of set lines of correlation lines of track location of 7 provision lines of cycles and 7 bodies of water. Puts position lines of track location lines to A track. A line centers in position north, east, west, and south line. Correlates data formation into one box frame calculation. The position of process is a line signal, has a triangulation split lines of anomaly, sets lines of course lines of communication, right? And directs lines of centers of the 4 lines A's, A's lines of B's, A's lines of C's, and Z lines of one low rotation surface. Positions its platforms in one setting at 3 set location at set location. Travel lines of the sun, modifies the system of the moon, rotates the surface in line configuration in line setting location of face recognition. Okay? Face recognition, done by equation. All right, it's all set up. Okay, so back in traction and setting, okay, all of the correlations of the Grothians. We set up the timeline sequence. I'm just showing you through platform how it's set location to seed pods. So we go through seed pod 1, okay, electrical line screen, and this goes through cortex line sending high interference, position of the process line screen. Now the correlation lines of track location comes at high setting. Now we set up data port screens, electrical grids, electrical panels, and one signal and one rotation surface. Now we go through cloud line that rotates the lines of its mapping line screen location setting and travel correlations of flux. Position its program line setting, flux lines of communication setting, data process line, electrical circuits, data formation lines on a 4-wave and panel and traction. Setting core lines high interference in position to its position location lines of its electrical line screen into all levels. Micro valves and correlation lines of tractions. Data formation into one valve into data formation lines out of 4 tractions. 4 data screens in line setting. Okay. Sets position of 1 traction in setting. Sets position lines of 4 track location and provision. Core lines, track lines opens up signals into modification of windows in track location and provision. Okay. Now that core lines attract higher lines of security in provision lines of cycles in perspective. Okay. It's really powerful stuff. All right, so we direct the line signals, we take the triangulation, Grothians come in and line signals, we cross line signals into 3 lines, calculations, screen location, setting, adaptation. Sets lines of center core system, ground lines, high center interference, travel point graphs. Sets communication Grothians, we go through 4 track provision. Yeah, there's the Grothian locations. They set up time sequences in one signal into patterns. Now the patterns online it's setting into operation surface and line position location and center calculations. Point line center high interference has a triangulation split that goes in the center core of its box location. It sets lines of visionary cortex lines of design line and correlation. Now direct lines calculation lines, we set up a line calculation setting to an oscillation path that opens up magnetic highway information lines of flux in center line communication system and travel in position to its location. Okay, so we go through Y line center, no more flux of the line connection to flat surface. Correlates calculation lines of 0, calculation lines of equals lines of 1 x line, 1 rotation, space, line, location, time. Sets lines of positive over negative, sets lines of 0 and 0 and 0 attractions. Triangulate lines of spot line, rotation, surface, and line condition setting into a data formation line calculation setting to its position of its program and face recognition. Okay, it's all done through triangulation. Resetting lines of flux is really understanding how to go through the evolution line screens. Now let's allocate your system location to settings. Accolades. Okay, now we go through all levels. Now the line communication line interference goes through an Eskimo. An Eskimo goes through the Arctic line rotation surface and tractions. Accolades line screen high center interference. Sets communication lines to its water and track locations. Direct lines of Grothians, sets lines of communication, travel lines, point lines of graph, and circle line and rotations. Sets communication lines above signal in line setting in position of its rhythm and program line rotation, surface, and tractions. Directs modification lines, all levels of console, all levels of navigation, all levels of division, all levels of rotations, all levels of calculation screen line. Directs modification line cycles and platforms of 1, 2, 3, and 4 set locations. Directs modification lines at ground line, surface, triangulate line interference in a particle accelerator and set location. There it is, and done by equation. That's the accelerator. Now we set up the 2 line screen as center core system that sets lines on all line rotation surface. We retriangulate the position of its program. We line setting location. We speed up the anomaly, and it goes around the central system in track location to its setting. How it sets lines of communications. We open up the portals. We line signal location setting. Okay, we balance out the routers and line rotation surface and triangulate the line communication set rotation and center core setting attraction. Done by equation. That's all set up. All right, so part of accelerator lines a high center interference of flux. It fluxes communication lines of data ports, sets location of docking center line communication and setting. Sets communication lines of 0, sets communication lines of 0, sets communication lines of 0, 0, 0, 0. Flux communication line, 1 strip line screen high interference and a 3 triangulation split lines anomaly, 6 lines, 8 lines, 10 lines to 12 set locations. Platforms 1 and position of 2 tubings and 1 track location line provision. XC1000 comes in and at 2 line centers and 3 track location. Scans position lines at high centers, 1 traction, 2 traction, 3 traction. Sets direct location settings at 2 panels. Opens all signals, graph communication lines of 0, sets communication ground lines of 0, sets communication line high interference and set location all of its magnetic high information line screens of platforms in position 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 set lines of 6, 7, and 8 track location lines of provision. Sets communication lines high center interference 1, 2, and 3 tractions. Directs modification lines of platforms of 1 cycle, 1 structure, 1 division, 1 location. Sets communication line interference to an XT1000 line screen that opens up all track locations. Direct modification platforms going in 1 traction at 3 settings, 1 line center high interference, 6 lines of correlation, 6 lines of track lines, 4 line center high interference, 3 track locations, 7 line rotation, surface, and traction. Done by equation. All right. Metric meters and scales on the accelerator is knowing exactly the chambered line. It positions its location to its system. Now it has an automatic drive line, automatic surface, and automatic atoms and automatic location. All right. 3 central line correlation settings, right? 3 A tracks, downshift, cross line screen, right? Direct lines of center core system and setting. Position of process in 1 set location. Sets lines of communication lines of tractions. Directs lines at all levels, vortex lines of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Sets communication lines of screens. Adaptation lines into a seat pod and traction. Directs lines of course. Sets lines of communication lines and navigating signals and line rotation surface and track locations. Sets communication line high interference into line setting into all levels of correlation. Astro projections, astro surface, astro line screen, and line condition setting in position of its program and calculations. Done by equation. Okay. All right, so the flux communication lines are the ground lines in accelerator. Accelerator equals lines of calculus line and set locations. Y lines, set locations of Y line system. Equals lines of core lines of tractions, right? Direct lines equals lines of H. H line centers, H line location, H line position, 8 lines of south. All right. So center core lines high center interference into line equals lines of lotus. Sets location equals lines of lotus, equals lines of lotus, equals lines of lotus. Sets communication lines, waiting on signal, flux, and communication line centers, point graphs, 3 settings, 3 traction, 3 provision. Okay. Calculate modify in line center high interference, Fibonacci 1 cycle, Fibonacci 2 cycles, Fibonacci 4 cycles of track location. Provision lines of cycles crosses line signal over cross location center in track locations. 1 central settings of L, right? Sets communication lines of product of line rotations in position location in half line cycle in set location. Direct modification lines of center in position of its operation surface and tractions. Direct modification lines of 1 cycle, 1 rotation, 1 surface, 1 track, 1 location setting. Position line process 1 center, 1 core, 1 center, 1 surface, 1 track location. Direct modification lines sending high interference into lines of H equals lines of L equals lines of Y. Y sets lines of communication lines of 0, 0, 0, and 0 and 4 set locations. Flux capacity now set up to 0 ground, center line, rotation, surface, and traction. Done by equation. It's all done. All right. So that leaves with the 2 panels of 1 equals lines of 1 line and 2 line condition setting into 2 panels into 1 L shape and line rotation surface. Done through line set locations, right? The Sapiens come in line track locations with each line rotation surface, constant correlation lines into bracket lines of 0, bracket lines of 0, bracket lines of panel lines of 0, and track location. Done by equation now. All right, it's all set up. All right, so flux diameters and line condition setting, a deviation screen lines of triangulation. So we have a triangulation split lines. Levels lines of screen lines to Y line equals lines of H. Now, each line set lines of H. So it's lines of correlation lines of H in track location. Direct modification lines of one level into two panels line rotation surface. So we take the Y line and cross line signals in both channel communication. Sets lines of communication opens up all line signals, aligns in a high interference and position location to a system that sets a tunnel in line surface interpretation and also calculates lines of clouds and direct lines of position to panel correlation. Direct communication lines of center sets lines of the flywheel and track location line setting to a location grid in line connection setting. Position of process line signals of the platform communication lines of 4 setting locations. Direct lines of platforms 1, 2, 3 crosses lines of 5 set location. Done by equation. All right, that's all set up. Set in the sun, set in the moon, in line rotations, waiting on signal, line rotation surface, and correlation lines of track set location. Sets communication lines of center line, center communication system, all lines center and line rotation surface and track location. It disappeared. It's going too fast. So I got to show you how it's all set up in 3 CPODs location. Done by equation, all right? The central system line condition setting, the growthing set the temperature readings. So we go through barometer lines, thermometer line rotation surface, track line conditions of 2 line settings, position lines of alpha, line center location of delta, and position location of theta, and line condition of 0 gravity, line condition of omega. Core line centers, box line frame location surface. Positions, platforms, core lines, track lines, human residence, platforms, line settings of A, C, and E line 1. Sets correlation of platforms, line center high interference, and dimensional lines of scales and dimensional line door in a 3-track location. Process communication lines of highest interference, puts a 0 gravity and triangulates split lines anomaly in 3 rotations. Position of platforms, platforms, line centers of E, line centers of 1, and track location of DX, and line center rotations. Track location lines of the temperature reading, core lines of track interference, interface recognition time sequence of panels. Position of process, 0 gravity, 0 correlation, 0 calculation setting to motion. Changing all communication lines of flux and 1 signal, 1 traction, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, and 3 split lines of anomaly in track location. Down by equation, all right? So your central system is out of motion. Now you're in motion line track locations in flux. Now we set up the lines of navigational lines. The course line centers has a bracket communication lines of 3 zeros and tractions. Sets lines of split lines and 2 track location provision. Setting communication lines of 1 line signal, 1 rotation surface. Panels correlation lines, all lines setting in position of mapping sequence. Sets communication lines on all levels of open sequence and travel. Points lines of graph, 1 center, 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 1 center. And track locations. Mapping sequence of water containment screen lines, adaptation lines of surface. Subterranean level, super of its consciousness, and line ground lines and high interference. Water containment line screens and a 3-line rotation surface and track location. Setting communication lines of water line surface and line conditions 0 gravity correlation. Sets communication lines of highest interference. Set lines of communication lines of negative and lines of positive or positive line condition setting in position locations. X lines of 1 in position lines of high interference. Flux communication line high calculation setting. X1 line communication 1 DX line rotation surface. Track location line centers of 3 lines of zeros in a line rotation surface. Down by equation. The center communication line setting is know exactly how to communicate line interference to center core line calculation setting. Flux communication at 3 line wavings. 6 communication line cross line screen location. Direct lines of panels in a half pipe location. The center core line center sets the Fibonacci line setting in rotation surface and traction. The center core line interference has line condition setting in position location of the system. CPOD line, center core system, and lines of all correlation line condition setting and position of program. Position process line, CPOD line rotation surface and position location setting and correlation lines of track location. Direct modification line screens highest interference of the earth line rotation surface. Sets position lines also in another CPOD location setting to all levels of shell of rotation. Direct modification line screen high interference sets communication line circulation, rotation surface, and track location line condition setting in all levels and all position programs and I correlation lines is spectrum correlation. Okay, done by equation. Okay, all right. The central system is the CPOD line screen that sets lines of correlation setting and track interference. Ground line signals, 1, 2 line rotation surface and traction. All right. Growthians come up in line setting high interference. There's the growthians and track location and provision. Calculates lines, cross-line signals, and three-line rotation surface. Sets communication of the sun, routes the routers, line rotation surface, and traction. Directs line signals, lines of XT thumbs comes out, ground line center correlation. Calculates modification ground lines, ripples effects, and line condition mapping sequence, mapping cores, line condition setting, encryption code, screen lines, adaptation lines, certification setting, ground line symbols, ground lines, letters, nebula shapes, and symbols in correlation setting, code signaling lines of platforms, communication lines of ground lines, and rotation surface interaction. Done by equation. All right, so that's done through the Earth. That's done rotation to Earth, correlation setting interactions. That's done. Now we set up the core line setting position of center correlations of platforms in 1, 2, 3, and 4 set location. Platforms communication, growth in the line, 1, 2, 4 set locations. You come out with the equation. Travel lines is calculation screen line, direct signals, right? Modificate the center's lines of travel. Now that points lines of graph calculation lines to its seed pod capsule communication lines to its space of its arc. Space arc comes in and calculation line conditions act of random kindness, calculation line center interference. AR lines is C, change lines of communications to K. K lines high interference into space, position lines of P, A, C, E. Calculation lines of A, line conditions setting, all lines center interference, and position of ARC. Space line communication setting, and travel position of point graph communicate equals lines. AR line setting R line C. Awareness, remembering, location of its width. Bandwidth over line screen, high calculated screen line, adaptation lines of surface, and application one provision, one cycle. Done by equation. Now the correlation of the space arc really has to understand the correlation setting of its capsule. It correlates the track lines to highest interference. It's a 150-meter line screen. Plasma screen lines high interference into HD. Now we are in its location setting. HDMI, okay. Sets communication lines of highest interference into CPU. Sets communication lines of the sun. Communicate line centers in the moon. And a triangular split lines anomaly in a flux, and a flux line communications. 4 triangulation split lines anomaly and traffication provision. Done by equation. So the H line center in position of flux is all lines of how you correlate the communication to its reactor, line communication to its screen. Directs lines modification to a flux line, correlate line interference in 1 center, 2 center, 3 center, and 4 track location. Sets communication lines in position of its location system and travel correlation lines attractions. Sets communication lines of 3 triangulation, 1 center, 1 rotation surface. Position of process in 1 lines, platform correlation setting, undergrounds, under traction, under position, under calculations. Spinnacle lines, screen lines, a tunnel line, opens all signals, open all modification screen lines, adaptation. Center core lines, XT1000 comes in a wind cycle, theta communication lines, high interference. Throttle command line rotations in position of throttle, and a 4 setting line communication setting of travel. Points lines of graph communication lines of 1, 2, 3 lines, 4 lines, track lines, setting, 6 lines of 8, and lines of 9, 9 lines of 10, 10 lines of 12, and track location provision. Done by equation. All right. So the flux is back in setting now. It's back to its nothingness. All right. Set locations. Now we go through the ground lines of the spice worms. Change the communication lines of grounds, electrical lines of infusion, and 4 lines of 5 line communication setting their travel correlation. Direct modification, there it is. There's the spice worm. Right? All right, so we have the spice worm core line communication setting travel position of ground lines. So communication lines, flux, communication ground lines. Spice worm rotates the routers and line interference. Now you understand what a flux capacitor is in its application. It's the spice worm that wraps around the coil, sets communication to compressors and line screen lines settings and adaptation lines of surface. Position of its process puts all communication sent to the grounds and communication lines into the power generation screen lines into magnetic highways and track location of center correlation lines of 8888 track location provision. Okay. Now the spice worms, they come into all lines of correlation setting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 set locations. Travel lines, 1 center correlation setting. Opens all signals of modification line calculation configuration of phase direction of space and time. Done by equation. All right, so the flux is now nothingness and line condition setting. Coil regenerators. Direct lines and modification lines of regeneration screens of cell modification. All right, so we go through cell lines equal to lines of L, lines and line condition setting. We're no longer communication lines of Y lines. No flux communication of flat surface. Now we're equalize correlation lines and equal line calculation lines. Back in E, calculation lines equals lines at M, set lines of C in position of square root. Now the square root is now in position of flux capacitor. That is your new triangulation spot line, correlation track lines, the high center interference. Home in position locations, right? So your home center is now in center core system. Press the enter correlation lines, attract lines, and two provision cycles and line condition setting in one position in one program. Directs modification line screen, high calculation to a system, right? So you guys are now in flux, in position of no emotion. All levels are track locations and provision. That puts you all lines of communication setting in flux line calculation setting in position location system. All levels of being home in track location. That my question. Platforms correlation setting, flux lines of high correlation stark interference, data formation screen location. Center core is line centers of flux lines of three triangulation lines of three spot location centers, four track location setting. Sites communication lines of satellites of 1, 2, and 3 and 4, and position of 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 location centers of travels. Points lines of graphs, center lines communication interference, travel point graph communication. Now, the set lines of communication of spice worms correlate to track interference, change the metric meter scales of the grounds. Schumann resonance goes to alpha, delta, theta, and omega set location, done by equation. All done, all through flux. All formation screen lines and all direct location system. Now you understand what a flux capacitor is? It's the spice worm that goes around the coil. All right, so once you understand the direct line signals, we go in a line rotations to surface. We go through the center core system of the Fibonacci line screen. Sets communication lines of flux in line set location of 6 and 9 in track locations. Equals lines of correlation lines, sets communication lines XT. So we got an XT line screen in position over line set locations. One's up, one's above, right? So T line opens all screen. The set lines communication of lines patterns. Equal line correlation lines of north, east, and west, and south, and track locations. With a team, it's a central lines of a 24 weighting panel of a flux correlation line setting a response. Setting direct lines calculation setting, bringing 6 and bringing 9 in track location and provision of cycle. Direct lines infinity 8 in rotation surface and track location, turning it into a lotus flower in track location 4 settings. Propellers lines of screen, opens all signals, open all tracking, waiting on signal, line rotation surface, and fly recognition time sequence calculation setting. Process communication lines of its flywheel, track line centers, track location system, in provisions of cycles and correlation lines of traction. Direct modification line signals, line calculation setting, and ground line surface and set locations back to 0. Now we're in set location. You see the fly? All right. To understand your line screen lines, guys, you have to understand the adaptation lines and certification systems all through allocate time frames. That's all position your system location of box frames. All right. So you guys are going to get you guys line screen line interference into all levels of AVR, communication lines, highest interference, remembering cycles into virtual, sets communication lines of its awareness, communication lines of CPU. That puts all prodigal line screen line interference into X lines of Y in position 1J center. Flame communication and tractions, Jekyll and correlation of the lines and position levels, getting lines of tango, line foxtrot in position program lines, one center core system, and a half pipe tractions, Pac-Man, and set location. Direct modification lines, all lines, dissolve line signals, and center core setting and travel. Points lines of graph and communication to its position of pi in track location of 1/3, one myomenon. The anomaly line rotation grounds the system to an anagram set location of center. Sets communication line centers of one cycle, one center, one rotation surface and tractions. Direct lines of one center, one rotation line condition setting to magnetic highway formation of a cloud. Directs modification line screen, sets lines of circles, line center high interference, and center core system of travel. Done by equation, right? That's all done. The metric scales and balance of the barometer, thermometer, lines of high center interference is the thermal. Center core lines of thermal equals lines of flux now. Position lines of correlation. So you are in now E equals sets lines of MC in calculation lines of box frame in position of flux. That is your timestamp line setting and set location. Congratulations. So you have to understand how this all works now, because taking E equals MC square is a triangulation split lines of anomaly. 3 centers and correlation lines of tractions, right? 3 settings equals lines of 4, sets communication lines of 7 traction. 7 bodies of water in line rotation surface takes the E line center in a half pipe. Setting triangulation in no lines, no line communication, no line high interference, no more separation triangulation. Sets communication all lines of high center interference of flux and correlation. Okay? Satellite communication line setting, tether communication. All right, done by equation, right? So we communication lines high interference gets more complicated. Bracket lines is zero line communication lines, high interference, box location, triangulation line condition, flux communication line center, wide line center. We put flat surface, correlation line interference, flat line. Says communication line graph. Says communication line signal. Back calculation line, Z force line, communication line, zeta, position of gamma line interference, radiation line communication, triangulation. Position of process, zero grounds, correlation setting, and triangulation revision. Done by equation. Okay. So E equals MC, lines of hyperpolarition flux now. So you get box flux, right? All right. All right, so in that position line changes everything location you're setting. Equilibrium according to line calculation, course, navigation location, and pre-flights. Position of process is understanding the Y line screens and sublocations, right? Sets lines of two tethers and tractions, satellite. So E equals line, and line setting C. That correlates line interference into one X line in position all levels. Negative, negative, line condition setting. Negative one side, but center correlation to center locations. Now, directing lines that calculates lines changes the Y line center in one position, one pattern. Sets communication line signals in position open pattern and track locations. Sets communication line center high interference in one cycle, one center. Sets communication line high interference in triangulation line condition setting. Process communication lines, shift lines of communications. Separate the communication lines of flywheel track location lines in high setting. Sets position location system and track correlation line conditions to its calculations. Sets communication lines of high center interference and position attractions, intelligence. All done by equation, all right? All right, so in that position lines, the correlation lines are track lines. Putting you guys in E equals MC, box triangulation, and triangulation line interference of flux. So the box line in position of flux now is in correlation, okay? Three line centers in position lines of three atmospheres in correlation setting attraction, okay? Says communication lines your battery in a reline position of its program. Files and correlation lines of tracks and settings puts all levels of correlation setting attractions. Direct lines of calculation setting in position of process. Now we go through alphabetical setting. Now we go through A, B, C, D, and we go E lines. We go through F. We go through G, G lines of H, and we go H lines of I. Has to be a certain line sequence. Set lines of correlation graph communication lines of J. Now the sets line connections of K. Lines of line interference L. Line centers of M. Sets communication lines of high interference, B equals lines of O. Sets communication lines of P. Sets for equalize correlation lines at flux. Sets communication lines of high calculation setting into Q. Line set high interference into R. Sets communication lines center locations of S. Set lines of T. Calculate modified line rotations and correlation setting attractions. So in that line high interference comes into U, and line set locations into V. Line connections in W. Sets lines correlation lines of X. Line calculation setting in positional calculation setting. Male cycles, correlation lines of female cycles of X, Y, calculation lines of Z, and track lines of XX position locations. Female cycles, male line rotation, surface interaction. All through equation. All done. All done. Your whole line screen, your alphabetical line center line condition setting is now in flux in position location in line conditions to its key. K-E-Y. Spectrum correlation lines of the key line rotation surface adds the universal lines of the keys of your universal line rotation surface and spectrum correlation. Direct calculation modification line screen high interference sets lines of communication lines and remembering the systematic line screen and line condition of top of waving line rotations in your flux through box centers and triangulation of three set locations of four settings. Done by equation, guys. It's all set up through your alphabetical system. Changing everything line set location is going through line set locations. Understanding the correlation lines, now we go through your clocking system. All through flux, right? Pattern correlation lines of 3, add lines of 6, and line set locations, right? So we had 3 channels, 3 correlation lines of 3, 3, 3. Sets communication line centers of 3 in center. Position lines of process of 3 set locations. Then we go through line calculation setting. Core attractions, core directions, cell modification screens, 2 panels on one side of space. 2 panels, lines, calculations of timelines in space, track location of 3 line cycles, line condition setting, and position location of data ports and correlation. Calculation line, how calculation line screen into electronic line communications, electrical bulb. Correlation lines, light bulb, line condition setting. So it's got line center high interference. It's got all calculations of megawatts. All right, so it's 1 million megawatts per second per line per square per unit. Sets lines of box frame into triangulation line condition setting to its position of its program. Sets communication line, highest interference, and intelligent location of its flux and set location. That my equation. It's all set. It's all set back to its nothingness. Retriangulating line centers a center in position, operation, surface, and track location. Magnetic highway information lines of its cloud, of its memory, back and track location of nothing to its set location. Done by equation, people. The flux is back to its nothingness. All right, so no core track location motion. Now we're in flux, correlation lines of track location and provision. All through science calculations, formula equation line screens. All right, so directing lines of modification, it gets much more easier if you understand the platitude. Now, getting in platitude and position location of its program gets all lines of signals in set location of your system. Because you guys are at emotional track now. Okay, so this is where it comes in a box. This is where it comes in line calculation of flux and position location of a T setting. Okay, you see the T? All right, so line position location is a box at 4 settings. Takes you out of filter, takes you out of line communication of its position. So you guys are out lines and screen lines and high adaptation now. So getting that position lines of its coil and its compressors, its altitude line screen high interference, how the flux goes into its capacitor. Position lines are 3 settings. Now the 3 setting is electrical line communication to its elixir, cosmic plane, and serpent fire. Now it's in track location. Setting line calculation set into data processor line position. Process communication line signals in position locations into 1 rotation surface interaction. Direct lines modification 1 cycle, 1 surface and track location. Closet correlation lines of the sun and the moon position its process waiting on signal line rotation surface interaction. Okay, look at that. That's my equation. All right, so the center core system is set up in set calculations. Astral projection lines of the Earth, line rotation, surface, and track locations. 1 center line condition setting. Process communication lines is an open signal that opens all panels in satellite rotation surface, Wi-Fi, satellites, correlation track interference, in position location system and travel. There's the satellite. That's my equation, guys. It's all done now, right? So it's amazing when you understand how to go through formula equation, line condition of flux. Sets lines of communication to its position of its probe location setting, guys, in position location, right? The home plate. All right, so directing lines of the home plate, templates, tablets, line screen highest interference, high position programs, box line highest interference. You guys are no longer in positional box frame. You're now in correlations of your main frames attractions, all right? So you got more lines of signals, more information lines of sovereignty and position of freedom and track location. Direct lines in 1 center and line set location in a half pipe. Sets communication lines of 1 signal, 2 tractions, and 3 set location. Direct lines calculation of 3 line centers, 3 provision, 3 cycles, 3 correlation, and 3 grounds. Sets communication lines highest interference and diamond shift line cross location screens. Sets communication line center interference and position location system. And line calculation setting galaxies, 1, 2, 3, and 4 track location. Position lines, flux, lines, highest interference, a 3 line rotation surface. Sets lines of communication line setting high interference and 0 gravity, 0 position, and 0 grounds, line connection setting, and positional process communication. Right? That's my equation. Okay. So I'm setting up the hangers, lines, screen lines, adaptation lines, serves, putting everything in line communication system. But it's amazing how you put these things in tracking lines of high calculation setting to a seed pod traction, all through alphabetical screen lines. Right? All through alphabetical screen line location setting, adaptation lines of surface. The process of data is understanding how to really put the operation line cycles. Now, all generation of screen lines, we go into the position location. That's where it gets complicated, right? So let's go to calculations. All right, let's go to line setting and interference. Sets communication line screens and adaptation lines of surface. All right, so we got point lines of graphs, docking centers line interference into 0 gravity, 0 correlations, 0 tractions, and 1, 0. Set lines of correlations of 1, 1, and 3 panels correlation. Complicated stuff. 1 flux, 1 center, 1 operation line set location, 1 location. Sets communication lines half pipe into solar sail and track line division and solar core line center. Now, in that position, we use the console. XT1000 comes in 1, 2, and 3 line rotation. 3 set lines of correlation and attractions, right? Direct lines of modification lines of 1 in position 2, 3, 4. Sets lines of 7 lines, 8 lines and settings, correlates track interference, sets communication lines and templates and tablets and pyramid location. 4 tractions and set position operation surface. Okay. Sets communication lines at center, balance communication on flywheel, track location line center, 1 set location. It disappeared. Triangulation 1 and position of 2 setting. Okay, done by equation. All right. All right, so the flux has now line center high interference. It's got its alphabetical line set locations back to 0. Past position line correlates into track interference is the presence and line calculation setting to its future. 3 wires of indicators now in 1 track location setting, right? Line setting, high line rotation, surface, and track location, right? Setting communication lines, cross line signals, and line communication to its position. Now that's where we are. All right, so we got 3 indicators. So the past, present, and future is now in the center position of the electrical line connections. This is a fuse box. It sets communication lines of 1 box frame in your data communication, right? Process 1 signal in line setting rotation. Cross lines 3 lines of box frames to set locations, right? Electrical communication lines, center communication, all levels of its position in a 3-line cycle and position of your earth line rotation surface. Okay. So, the center core system is now in triangulation. That position locations, plus you're working with 1 million megawatts. Out of correlation lines, the correlation track interference into correlation track center interference. So now we go through a D-line setting in line rotation equals lines of 1 level, sets location of flux. Now you're working with box location centers into an E-line and position lines, metric meters, calculations into calculation screen lines, MC, triangulate line interference, triangulation line communication location of flux. All right, so process communication line setting puts everything in all positions program. Puts all calculation lines as computed screen lines as 0. Sets communication lines at energetic line screen in position location. Center of operation. Done my question. All right, so the digital layers are now set up. The encryption codes are now line rotation surface and line setting high correlation lines of 2 panels, correlation lines of track interference and new ground center. Sets communication settings and position programs. Now direct lines modification puts everything in process calculation setting. So you're dealing with line calculation setting, graph calculation lines of 0s, in a 4-line panel, in position of 3 settings and tractions. Okay, so we got a 0 ground, equal line, and position of program. Now it's all graph calculations. 1 indicator north line center lines at east-west location. Track lines, high center interference. Platforms, lines of transits. Sets communication line, ground set location, op calculations, right? So we flux the communication lines of its arrow that indicates the position of its program. Okay, we're locked in signal here in travel. Position locations, center coordinates, and tractions. Position lines, 1 arrow indicates lines. Position of process, center coordinates system, and travel point lines of graphs. Center lines is communication setting, opens all communication setting in its flux of 0 gravity and no lines of communication, inline rotations, all of the track locations, and high calculation lines, inline rotations to its surface. Okay, done by equation. The 4 central centers of zeros correlates the center calculation screen lines. Okay, sets communication lines of 3 centers in correlation to the ground line centers, also locked again in calculations. 1 center interactions. Let's go inline rotation surface. We're going to correlate and track interference and position of travels. Okay, that point lines its graph and communication to its position. Okay, so we're going to recenter and track locations into 4 lines into 4 track location revision. So that's 4 lines of 3 track location of setting. Okay, sets communications, right? Now the ground line center line interference is electrical lines of defense, line connections, road graph communications. Direct lines of platitude, inline rotation surface. Sets communication lines, high interference, into 3 track location revision. 4 center and calculation lines of flywheel, track lines of infinity 8 line set location. All right, direct line signal locations. So in that line high interference, flux is line communication setting, all lots of correlation lines, 4 zeros and 3 track location lines. So you guys have a new line center and a 7-7 track location, right? So you're no longer in division lines and screen lines of 7 anymore. Your bodies of water is a 3 track revision of 7 equals lines of 7. Sets communication line highest variance and 7, 7, 7, 7, in line condition 144, set locations. Set coordinates line interference and line calculation setting to 244. Sets communication line 344. Sets communication lines of 444. Sets communication lines of 544. Sets communication lines is 644. Sets lines communication lines attractions, right? Direct calculation lines, the clock lines, highest interference, and 7 location lines is 7. 7 equals lines is 7. 7 equals lines and negative lines is 7. We have process communication lines of positive, 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 1 negative line rotations, 1 center core setting calculations. Direct lines of the sun, opposite location setting the travel point lines of grass. Sets communication 1 tither, 1 rotation surface, and line calculation setting towards Earth, and line condition of space. Travel point lines of graph, communication lines and high interference, and position location setting. Done equation. All right. How's everybody doing so far? So you have to really understand what's going on in the line settings now, guys, because it's very informative in position attractions all through a motion location system, right? So there's no sine and corresponding line condition motion now. You're dealing with all levels of flux. In the ground lines, graph calculation settings, and 4 lines of zeros and 3 location system. Back to zero correlation of the past, present, future. Done by equation. All right, so in that line inference, you come in your prodigies, you come in your brilliance, you come in your genius lines, calculations, screen lines, and memory. Position lines of its AVR, line rotation surface, equals lines coordinates setting. Flux and communications equals lines of box. Triangulation, calculations of box. Sets communication lines of box in a 3-line communication line system, its application. Sets communication lines highest interference into its awareness, a virtual reality's application. Direct calculation cross-line signals into timestamp 1-line rotation in surface and ground line surface and track application. Done by equation now, right? All right. So understand how this all works is all through flux. How this is all set up now. Okay. All right. So taking out emotional line track and adding flux lines, communication, levitation, graph calculations. So now you guys, line center high interference, you're at position location 100% in capacity. Okay. Center core lines at 0 gravity. Okay. Equals lines of correlation. 0 emotion is now in setting. All right. You're working with the flux and sending correlation to 3 lines with center correlations past, present, future, and center correlation into line condition setting in a line rotation surface in location system. Center core attractions. Mm-hmm. So that's where everybody is now right now. Right? So you have to learn how to use your flux and levitation graphs, sets communication lines as position of its program, and line settings. So the center core line center into the satellites, modems, and Wi-Fi is really understand how to position its position location of its program. Sending communication lines of highest interference at 0 and 2 tractions. Sending communication lines to set location and flux. And calculate setting. Y lines equals lines of flat surface. 1 alpha line rotations. Now we got a beta line signal and a rotation centers and correlation line calculation setting. Ground line signals and a motivation graph correlation setting attractions. Now in that direct line signal, so you got to stay above the set locations, which is line center locations is 10,000 line. Okay, hard deck. Center coordinates lines of 10 over 12. Graph communication lines, center coordinates track interference, alpha bravo. And set calculations, right? Done by equation, right? All right, so that's all set up in position lines of graph materials and location, sending the space lines and anomaly, sending line communication to its position, its program through its anagram. Setting line communications algorithm is really understand how to use the process communications, but I wanted to show how powerful it is when we can set up graph communication lines that formulate equation location of flux and line setting, bringing all communication lines to line communications and interference in position to your body, correlation lines of 4 track region of zeros and 3 track line setting, 7 line provision lines of cycles, no more lines of communication and motion. It's all tractation of flux. We are done. All right. 19 over 7. So we had 19 lines of volume. Correlates calculation lines of 7 equals lines of 7 equals lines of beta, theta, omega, and correlation lines of zeta. Box frames correlation lines set and interference equals lines of 23 tractions, 23 locations, 3 line centers division, and 3 center locations of Earth in calculation. Direct lines of highest interference, ground lines, center line rotation center in position of energetic line screen, and platforms 1, 2, 3, and 4 tractions. Sets lines of communication and flux, set lines correlation setting 48 tractions into 48 line rotation surface and tractions. Bounce communication lines of 8, sets lines of 8, sets lines of 8, sets lines of 8, sets lines of 8, platforms of 0, and correlation and ground lines in rotator and line rotation surface and traction. Done by equation. Okay? It's not a coincidence that it landed on 48, guys, all right? So the 4 provision lines of cycles is 0 gravity correlation setting attractions. You got a 3 central unit now. in position to all levels of your main frame, out of box frame. It's all set up. All through your clocking system now. Okay. Then you go to line communication setting and process calculation. Face recognition is next. And position of its program, guys, in this application. Okay. Set position, correlation, setting, and traction. Okay, we're done. All right, so everybody okay? Trying to figure what's going on in position of travels. Know how powerful it is when you get your ground, your settings. Is it coincidence that we're at 25 and 7? No. 30 communication lines of 2 lines, a high center interference of 5, sets communication setting, turn in your line communication in set location in position in all levels and correlation. Okay, to its reactor. The process lines of its lotus turns its line communication waiting on signal because it has to be a certain frequency. Changes everything through your Y-line screen. That puts everything in operation line set location setting. What are we in track provision of? 26 of our lines of 7. Okay. So understanding the correlation setting to the inner cycles and the outer cycle location system puts all levels of platitude. Getting your position lines of highest interference, getting all lines of communication setting, taking you out of zero gravity, zero motion, into flux. Okay, into home plate. Track line provisions, cycle line calculation setting, right? That positions your location suite system. So what just happened through my computer? Went back to 0 in flux. See you guys in 5.